I guess what's obvious to me, particularly in the media, is that those that treat others well invariably seem to be the ones that survive, no matter how high their profile might be at a particular time. If they treat people decently, and that could be as simple as hello to the receptionist on the way in, how was your weekend, that kind of stuff. I know it sounds really simple, but so many people don't do it. And we're all self-absorbed to a degree, but it doesn't take much to be considerate. You're talking about a few seconds of your day. And look, I think those things stick with you. I was going to give you a few examples. One of Australia's best known and longest serving newsreaders. She's pretty tough in the work environment, but it's not about ego with this person. It's about getting the best product to air. You can meet this person 10 years later, 15 years later. She always remembers your partner's name, always remembers your children's names, what they were doing, always shows that level of interest. I think that's an inherent reflection of her decency. A couple of really minor things, but they kind of stick in your mind. There was, a very well-known Melbourne identity who I worked with for a year or so back in the early 90s. He's had his challenges, but still certainly very well known. I hadn't seen him maybe for 20 years. We were both at a function together, and he came up to me. Again, I wouldn't have thought he would even have recognized me after all these years, and was the most engaging in his chat with me. Obviously knew who I was, introduced his son to me. And I go, wow, that's pretty impressive for a guy who's one of the biggest stars in media and in football administration. Similar incident, I was at a sporting event, and there was, again, a very high profile, well-known breakfast program host. And again, I'd only worked with him really briefly back in the late 80s. And this was literally 25 years later. And he came over to me, said g'day, and knew my name. And I'm going, that's pretty impressive. That's why 30, 40 years on, this person's still at the top of their game. And I thought that was really quite significant. But one I always remember was when I just left school and I'd started work at a newspaper in Sydney called the Daily Mirror. And I just turned 18, and I was working in the radio room, the police radio room. That's where you listen to all the emergency calls. It was the shit job that all these young staff were given when they first started. And I was on duty on the 18th of January, 1977. And over the police radio, I heard an ambulance call to say that there'd been a rail accident near Granville. And that was the only message that came through for quite some time. And you're pretty nervous when I'd only been in the job for about 2 months. Anyway, I decided to ring the photographer. That's what you did in those days. You ring the news photographers, and they'd go out and suss it out. So they did that. And obviously that turned out to be the Granville train disaster, which was Australia's worst ever rail accident. I think 84 people died as a consequence. But this had happened about just after 8 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, I got this call through to the radio room, and the guy on the end of the line was Steve Liebman. Now, Steve Liebman at that stage was the number one radio announcer in Sydney on 2SM, which was the number one radio station at that time. His audience was about twice what Alan Jones ever got and what Ray Hadley gets. It wasn't his researcher that rang. It wasn't his producer that rang. What Steve had done is he'd rung during the news bulletin. So he had 4 or 5 minutes where he could chat to get the latest on the situation. He'd obviously heard that our guys were the first on the ground there, and he rang me to get as much information as he could. And he continued to ring me every half hour during the news segment. So he was fully informed as he went to air after the news. On each occasion, he was incredibly polite and gracious. He's talking to an 18-year-old kid. He's the number one radio star in Sydney, doing all his own work. And I'd kind of put it aside because I was about to finish my shift. And then he rang again at the end of the program and just wanted to thank me for the help that I'd given him. And I was absolutely blown away by that. And I always have remembered that throughout my career. Some 30 years plus later, I actually employed Steve. So Steve obviously went on to be the first host of the Today Show, was news presenter on Network 10, one of the most admired media figures in Australia. And I ultimately ended up towards the later stage of his career, giving him a job reading the weekend news. And I mentioned that story to him, and he was quite moved by that. But he just said, well, isn't that the right thing to do? And you kind of go, that's why this man is respected and had longevity, that, it was the right thing to do. So I just think that kind of epitomizes to me that for all the criticism of people, particularly high profile people, there are inherently decent people, and they're considered inherently decent because of the way that they treat others, no matter what level of the organisation they're at.